Well, welcome back. We are just continuing with World War II. The second part of our notes. Please make sure to use this, especially if you're home for COVID or other illness. You got to keep up on the notes. I know it's difficult. I didn't swamp you with a lot of work. This is the trade-off. I'm expecting you still to go online and to be able to get the information in the notes for your study guide. And of course, if you do attend every day to school, it's a good review in case you're unclear or you just need a quick refresher. Last time we talked, we covered Pearl Harbor. Within 3 days, Germany had declared war, followed by Italy. The U.S. was in a truly global conflict. Now, the military knows that it doesn't have the material enough for its use in the Army, the Navy, the Army Air Corps, the Marines, and home use. So the U.S. government goes into what's called rationing. Government has to control what consumers at home get, and because they control the goods that are available, those supplies and material can be directed to the war effort first. Industry absolutely goes into overdrive. A lot of factories were sitting in the 1930s vacant and unused because of the Great Depression. Absolute full employment results. In fact, we start migrating people in from other countries in order to cover the distance. Now, men were sent off to war. Remember, as many as 16 million Americans are going to be into the military, the vast majority of which are men. They have to be replaced by someone. Minorities and women, particularly women, are going to come into the workforce and pick up the slack. In fact, at the height of World War II, 1/3 of all workers in the United States are female. There is still discrimination. I don't want to make it sound perfect, but this is the time where women begin to see real gains in their standard of living and their opportunities, something they're going to carry forward after World War II, particularly starting in the 1970s. We talked in class, in fact, we spent a day on this, Rosie the Riveter, that propaganda image of a woman who transcends the traditional female role, embracing factory production or farm production or whatever it is the U.S. government needs to have happen. Women also joined the military in a support capacity, such as delivering aircraft. It freed men for direct combat duty. Now, all of this is going to end the Great Depression, but it doesn't mean the government has everything it needs in order to cover the distance financially. Americans still have to contribute to the war outside of the normal methods, and so the U.S. government relies on war bonds. In fact, they will have 6 different major drives on war bonds. Citizens simply buy these bonds knowing that down the road they will turn a profit. So if you spend $100, you know you're going to get your $100 back plus interest. And because that interest is earned, it's a good financial incentive to help the war effort now, and it's really going to kickstart the U.S. economy in the late 40s and early 50s when we see the growth there. Now, let's be honest. Income tax is another way that our government today pays for what it needs to. From 1941, at the end of the year when World War II started, we had already seen taxes steadily go up, but after that, we're going to see an increase in the income tax being collected, 400% over the next 4 years. So taxes and war bonds are a big way that we see the war being paid for. Speaking of paying for something, Japanese Americans are going to pay for racial animosity towards anyone of Japanese ancestry after Pearl Harbor. Now, this clearly is racialized because Germans and Italians were not singled out. The Japanese were. And we're talking about the West Coast. In Executive Order 9066, Roosevelt comes in and he allows the military to designate who is allowed and who will not be allowed into those areas. And so when we're looking at internment, we're talking about camps that are set up during the war where Japanese and Japanese Americans are relocated. A lot of you have passed, if you've driven to Disneyland, one of the largest ever, and that is outside of Bishop, California, if you've driven down to Disneyland, a place called Manzanar. If you ever get a chance to stop and take a look at that museum, I really encourage you to do that. Minorities are going to join the military, and one of the brighter spots will be for at least for Japanese Americans, the 442nd and the 100th Combat Battalion. Those two units are going to be some of the highest decorated units, in fact, the highest decorated units in the war and throughout American history. But we see African Americans in segregated units. If you get time, you might want to look up the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen. We see, as I mentioned, Japanese Americans in segregated units. And this transitions when we look at a racialized view of things to what the Germans are doing. Now, even before World War II, German laws discriminated against Jewish people, took away their citizenship, took away their property, and eventually started taking away their life. The final solution, which was approved in the early 1940s, meant that millions of Jews that had been captured as Germany had expanded its borders across Europe and into the Soviet Union, those Jews are then going to suddenly be funneled into concentration camps in what's called genocide. Now, genocide is the organized extermination of an entire group of people. So the Holocaust is the World War II example of genocide. And we'll spend a lot more time in class learning about this. But as you can see on the map there, all those facilities there were designed largely to wipe out Jews in Europe. And I'm sorry to say, it was pretty effective. 2/3 of Jews would be held in these concentration camps and murdered. Absolutely terrifying the extent and the success the Nazi regime had in achieving that goal. Now, a concentration camp is an area where people are killed and cremated quickly. And as you can see in the picture up there, 11 million, in fact 11.5 million are going to die. Political prisoners, people who were captured in the war, homosexuals, political dissidents, and of course the Jews. Now, the UN would later create, or at least help foster, the creation of Israel. It is the majority Jewish nation. It's in the Middle East. We'll spend more time on that when we get into the Cold War. Originally, the U.S. does not have the material, it doesn't have the troops to really get involved in fighting in Europe. So we have to support Russia, Britain, and our other allies through a program called Lend-Lease. Roosevelt looked at it this way: if your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend them a garden hose. You don't let that house burn to the ground. Number one, it's the wrong thing to do. Number two, if their house burns down, all it takes is an ember and your house burns down. It's a way for him to skirt public opinion at the time. After December 7th, there's no issue with skirting public opinion. Americans are very much in support of Lend-Lease. We're going to invade North Africa in 1942, pushing the Nazis out. Italy in 1943. Around that time, Mussolini is really under pressure, and by 1944, he's basically removed from power. Hitler then invades Italy, its ally, and takes that over as well in order to try to stabilize its borders. The top picture is of an invasion called Normandy. It is the largest invasion, amphibious assault in the history of the world. 250,000 men take part in that invasion on June 6, 1944. It is going to signal the end of German control of West Germany. The bottom picture really shows how World War II was won in Europe. Yes, the Americans and British would push from the West. It's the Russians from the East that really devastate the German war machine. And by 1945, they're able to meet up. In fact, in April, they meet up at the Elbe River. By the end of April, beginning of May, Hitler has killed himself, and the resulting new Nazi government gives unconditional surrender. Japan's going to be a little different situation. This is over water, so the Navy's going to take the lead on this. Japanese naval units are slowly whittled down. After Midway in June of 1942, most of its frontline carriers are destroyed. A year and a half later, we're going to see most Japanese carriers no longer combat effective. At that point, the large casualties that are resulting from the banzai charges, from the ships being sunk, it really actually solidifies in the Japanese mindset that they are going to go down fighting no matter what. And by 1944, you see the U.S. come face to face with Japanese aggression in a new type of attack, which we call kamikaze. It's Japanese for divine wind. It has to do with an invasion of Korea hundreds of years before. Both in the air, kamikaze pilots would crash their aircraft into enemy ships, and even they developed in Japan a human-steered torpedo in order to attack shipping from the water. Now, The air attacks are the ones that had the most success for the Japanese. By 1943, it's very clear that the Germany First policy, which was thought was necessary because we didn't have enough war material for both fronts, we realized very early in 1943, that we don't have to wait anymore. And so we have enough in order to take on the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. And so by 1944, we're going full bore towards them. With the next 2 years essentially being an island hopping campaign, slowly working our way to the home islands, millions of Japanese are prepared for this horrific invasion. And the Americans know it's going to be a gigantic loss of life. Two things are going to avoid that. One, the use of the atomic bomb starting in August of 1945. The other thing is the Soviet Union declaring war that same day against the Japanese. It becomes very clear in the first couple of days between the Soviets and this new offensive using this new weapon, the atom bomb, that the Japanese have no chance of winning, and they'll sue for peace. Just to illustrate what we're talking about, if you look at up on the screen right now, this is basically our weapons today that we have. Now, the little boy killed tens of thousands of people instantly, so you can understand why the 20th century is so dominated with nuclear weapon concerns, because it's this age of mass destruction that nuclear weapons promises to provide us that is just so scary. It was actually created by the Manhattan Project. The first city, Hiroshima, was destroyed on August 6, 1945. 3 days later, Nagasaki was destroyed. Total death within a couple of days at 250,000. Tens of thousands more injured. As I said, the Japanese surrender, and it's actually going to help kickstart the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. By 1949, the Soviets have the bomb. That's going to be a problem too. Let's talk about some of the results. As you know, the U.S. is a superpower nation, probably still the most powerful superpower nation on the planet. We are done with isolationism. The U.S. now sees ourselves as leader of the free world. We advertise that regularly, and we project power as a result. War crimes trials are held by these military leaders into the defeated nations to make them accountable for the millions of people who were killed. We're not going to have a lot of time to get into it, but the Japanese tested chemical and biological weapons on the Chinese. And obviously the Holocaust with the German Nazi regime, that's going to be a problem. The U.S. economy had completely recovered from the Great Depression, and although there'll be a little hiccup after the war, by the 1950s, you're going to see the largest peacetime economic growth that this nation has ever seen. And as I said earlier, the Cold War, even with all that prosperity, the Cold War is still an issue, and that threat of nuclear war. If you have any questions, please give me an email. I want to certainly help. Make sure you're filling out your notes. Stay on top of the study guide, and we'll see you later.